Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable lives and even more remarkable near-death experiences of medieval mothers. The women who braved childbirth in an era when your best prenatal care was a prayer and your midwife also moonlighted as the village gossip. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Congratulations. You've managed to get pregnant without modern medicine, without ovulation tracking, and probably without much personal space. Welcome to medieval motherhood, where your womb is now public property and science is mostly vibes. You don't pee on a stick. Instead, you pee in a clay pot and someone examines it for color, bubbles, or whether it smells like female essence. That's the closest you'll get to diagnostics. One herbalist might drop a needle in your urine and watch to see if it rusts. If it does, you're with child or haunted, maybe both. Naturally, you don't tell anyone right away, but your vomiting gives you away by day 3. Within a week, half the village is whispering about your condition, and the local midwife starts dropping heavy hints like, "Don't lift anything heavier than your own sin." Your diet becomes a circus of contradictions. No eels, they'll make the child slippery. No cabbage, it breeds flatulence and heresy. And absolutely no rabbit meat, unless you want your child to grow up with wild eyes. You're instead advised to eat white bread, apples, and whatever the neighbor's goat didn't finish. Someone gives you a charm made of lead. Another insists on hanging wolf's fur above your bed. Your mother-in-law hands you a walnut carved with the Lord's Prayer and says it protected her through 9 births. 6 survived, which by medieval standards is practically bragging. You're warned not to look at the moon, lest your baby be marked. Don't step over dogs. Don't think sinful thoughts, especially about Brother Oswin, the young monk. Definitely don't laugh during storms. Everything leaves a mark. The local priest advises confession. Just in case your moral failings are contagious, you sit politely through a sermon about Eve and temptation, all while clutching a dried toad some healer gave you for womb balance. That's not a euphemism. It's literally a toad sewn into a pouch worn on your hip. Your husband, he's thrilled, probably. He celebrates by drinking too much ale and boasting about how his seed took root. He won't be there for the delivery. Of course, childbirth is women's work and witchcraft, but mostly work. And so you wait, charm-laden, frog-adjacent, and mildly terrified. Welcome to your first trimester, where the medical consensus is don't anger God and maybe drink some warm milk. So you're expecting, and unlike today, there's no prenatal yoga, no glowing bump pics, and definitely no baby shower where people gift you artisanal pacifiers. Instead, your medieval prenatal care package includes superstition, guesswork, a handful of roots, and a stern midwife who smells like garlic and knows all your secrets. First things first, your health. The village healer suggests you stay warm but not too warm, move but not too much, and think pleasant thoughts unless they involve men. In short, avoid doing anything that might upset your humors. Yes, humors, those charming bodily fluids that medieval doctors believed controlled everything from pregnancy to personality. You're mostly phlegm now, apparently. Congratulations. Your prenatal vitamins come in the form of plants with questionable reputations. Rue, fennel, mugwort. You're told to boil them into tea, but no one mentions side effects. Side effects include nausea, fainting, and hallucinations of Saint Margaret telling you to lie down. Saint Margaret is the patron saint of childbirth. She's very busy. As your belly grows, your midwife begins visiting more frequently, mostly to make sure you haven't done anything stupid, like ride a horse, look at a wolf, or speak Latin. These are all considered high-risk behaviors. You're supposed to stay calm, avoid storms, and never, under any circumstances, witness an execution. Apparently, that can scare the baby crooked. Of course, executions are the town's main form of entertainment, so staying away is harder than it sounds. And then there's your emotional state. You're told that sadness leads to sickly babies, which is a little tricky given your medieval reality. To boost morale, women gather to sing hymns and gossip. They also tie red ribbons around your bedposts, hang garlic in the rafters, and sometimes sleep on the floor in case demons are attracted to your scent. How comforting. the baby's movement. That's called quickening. And when it happens, everyone treats it like a royal event. You are congratulated, kissed, and possibly sprinkled with holy water just to be safe. The midwife nods sagely and mutters, "A strong one, probably not cursed." You spend your final months waddling around, avoiding stairs and trying not to sneeze too hard, lest it trigger labor. And remember, no baths. In short, your pain management options are as follows: hope, prayer, and the duet tones of distant livestock. But don't worry, the agony will pass eventually. Probably, maybe. And if all goes well, you'll be rewarded not with rest, but with immediate breastfeeding and zero postpartum care. Because in the medieval world, the moment you give birth, you're back to being useful again. So how long will this take? You ask the midwife, hopeful. She responds with a cryptic grunt and a prayer to St. Anne, which is not exactly encouraging. Welcome to medieval labor, where time has no meaning and pain is measured in rosary cycles. Could take 2 hours, could take 2 days. Either way, you're in it now. And no one brought a sundial. You sit on the birthing stool, then lie down, then squat, then pace, then kneel, then curse, then return to sitting, because the other options make your knees sound like a bag of walnuts. Every time you shift positions, the midwife claims it's to help the child find its way. You begin to suspect the baby's using a medieval map full of dragons and dead ends. The room grows, hot, then cold, then hot again. Time stretches. Is it still Tuesday? Does Tuesday exist? Is this even your house anymore? The women around you keep the mood light by casually discussing previous labors. One of them gave birth during a thunderstorm and claims her son can smell lightning. Another insists that if you rub lard on your lower back and shout the psalms backward, the baby will slip right out. No one tests this. Meanwhile, your uterus continues its slow thundering drumbeat. The contractions arrive like drunk knights at a feast, unpredictable, loud, and impossible to ignore. You try counting them. You lose track. You try singing between them. You lose your will to sing. Eventually, you just stare at the wall and begin naming the cobwebs. One is definitely moving. Every so often, someone brings you broth or tells you you're doing great or suggests you relax. That person is then removed from the chamber for their safety. There are no clocks, just the flickering of the candle, the sweat on your brow, and the constant presence of the midwife, who somehow still hasn't blinked. Then, without warning, the chaos intensifies. The midwife leans in. She nods. It's time. But time for what exactly? Hope, glory, internal collapse? Doesn't matter. Your body takes over now, and you're about to push a tiny medieval citizen into a world of mud, superstition, and goat-based nutrition. Congratulations. You've reached the climax of eternity. Your husband, let's call him Wulfik because of course his name is Wulfik, is not in the room. That's by design. In medieval times, childbirth is firmly a women's domain, and men are kept outside, away from the screaming, bleeding, praying, and all-around chaos, mostly for their protection and everyone's patience. Wulfik is currently pacing in the courtyard, whispering to the local priest, fingering his prayer beads like he's trying to start a fire. He has no idea what's going on inside, but he assumes it involves lots of blood, maybe some screaming, and possibly St. Margaret descending from heaven to assist personally. He wasn't invited into the birthing chamber, and frankly no one wants him there. Men faint. They panic. They ask unhelpful questions like, is this normal? And should it be making that noise? And can someone fetch me a chair? No. Wulfrich's job is moral support from a safe distance. He's expected to pray, pace, and look worried, ideally in that order. If he really wants to help, he can slaughter a chicken for the post-birth stew, or fetch clean linens, or stop bothering the midwife every 20 minutes with, is it here yet? The only exception to this ban is if you die. In that case, Wulfrich might be allowed in to say goodbye, look dramatically stricken, and then immediately remarry your cousin within a fortnight. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Back inside, the women are doing just fine without him. You're being fanned with a goose wing. The midwife is muttering incantations. and the village herbalist has just spilled something green and sticky near the fireplace. Everything's going according to plan. Meanwhile, Wulfrich continues pacing, flanked by older men who nod sagely and say things like, "It's in God's hands now," or "My third wife survived one just like this." No one dares suggest going inside. The last man who tried was slapped by a midwife and excommunicated for impertinence. In short, childbirth is women's work. Men may contribute at the beginning and celebrate at the end, but in between their best strategy is to stay out of the way and try not to weep into the turnips. After hours, possibly days and of contractions, panting, praying, and wondering if your bones are slowly turning inside out. In short, your pain management options are as follows: hope, prayer, and the duet tones of distant livestock. But don't worry, the agony will pass eventually. Probably, maybe. And if all goes well, you'll be rewarded not with rest but with immediate breastfeeding and zero postpartum care. Because in the medieval world, the moment you give birth, you're back to being useful again. So how long will this take? You ask the midwife, hopeful. She responds with a cryptic grunt and a prayer to St. Anne, which is not exactly encouraging. Welcome to medieval labor, where time has no meaning and pain is measured in rosary cycles. Could take 2 hours, could take 2 days. Either way, you're in it now. And no one brought a sundial. You sit on the birthing stool, then lie down, then squat, then pace, then kneel, then curse, then return to sitting, because the other options make your knees sound like a bag of walnuts. Every time you shift positions, the midwife claims it's to help the child find its way. You begin to suspect the baby's using a medieval map full of dragons and dead ends. The room grows, hot, then cold, then hot again. Time stretches. Is it still Tuesday? Does Tuesday exist? Is this even your house anymore? The women around you keep the mood light by casually discussing previous labors. One of them gave birth during a thunderstorm and claims her son can smell lightning. Another insists that if you rub lard on your lower back and shout the psalms backward, the baby will slip right out. No one tests this. Meanwhile, your uterus continues its slow thundering drumbeat. The contractions arrive like drunk knights at a feast, unpredictable, loud, and impossible to ignore. You try counting them. You lose track. You try singing between them. You lose your will to sing. Eventually, you just stare at the wall and begin naming the cobwebs. One is definitely moving. Every so often, someone brings you broth or tells you you're doing great or suggests you relax. That person is then removed from the chamber for their safety. There are no clocks, just the flickering of the candle, the sweat on your brow, and the constant presence of the midwife, who somehow still hasn't blinked. Then, without warning, the chaos intensifies. The midwife leans in. She nods. It's time. But time for what exactly? Hope, glory, internal collapse? Doesn't matter. Your body takes over now, and you're about to push a tiny medieval citizen into a world of mud, superstition, and goat-based nutrition. Congratulations, you've reached the climax of eternity. Your husband, let's call him Wulfric, because of course his name is Wulfric, is not in the room. That's by design. In medieval times, childbirth is firmly a women's domain, and men are kept outside, away from the screaming, bleeding, praying, and all-around chaos, mostly for their protection and everyone's patience. Wulfric is currently pacing in the courtyard, whispering to the local priest, fingering his prayer beads like he's trying to start a fire. He has no idea what's going on inside, but he assumes it involves lots of blood, maybe some screaming, and possibly Saint Margaret descending from heaven to assist personally. He wasn't invited into the birthing chamber, and frankly no one wants him there. Men faint. They panic. They ask unhelpful questions like, is this normal? And should it be making that noise? And can someone fetch me a chair? No. Wulfric's job is moral support from a safe distance. He's expected to pray, pace, and look worried, ideally in that order. If he really wants to help, he can slaughter a chicken for the post-birth stew, or fetch clean linens, or stop bothering the midwife every 20 minutes with, "Is it here yet?" The only exception to this ban is if you die. In that case, Wulfrich might be allowed in to say goodbye, look dramatically stricken, and then immediately remarry your cousin within a fortnight. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Back inside, the women are doing just fine without him. You're being fanned with a goose wing. The midwife is muttering incantations, and the village herbalist has just spilled something green and sticky near the fireplace. Everything's going according to plan. Meanwhile, Wulfrich continues pacing, flanked by older men who nod sagely and say things like, "It's in God's hands now." Or, "My third wife survived one just like this." No, one dares suggest going inside. The last man who tried was slapped by a midwife and excommunicated for impertinence. In short, childbirth is women's work. Men may contribute at the beginning and celebrate at the end, but in between their best strategy is to stay out of the way and try not to weep into the turnips. After hours, possibly days and of contractions, panting, praying, and wondering if your bones are slowly turning inside out, the moment finally arrives. You are now entering the main event, actual childbirth medieval edition. Spoiler alert, it's messy. You're either squatting, lying on a straw-stead mattress, or seated on the sacred birthing stool, which sounds ceremonial, but is really just a wooden toilet seat with ambition. Gravity is your friend. Sort of. Mostly, it's just rude. The midwife, a battle-hardened woman with forearms like blacksmiths, positions herself with the calm confidence of someone who's done this hundreds of times, often with one hand and a soup ladle. She tells you to push and you do. Then you push again and again and again until you're fairly sure. Your soul is also trying to exit. There are no encouraging wail sounds or epidurals, just the rustle of fabric, the stifled gasps of other women, and the occasional chant. The priest outside mumbles a quick prayer. The chickens outside the window don't care. The baby apparently is on its own timeline. Then suddenly a shift, a cry, a splash, a collective intake of breath. And with one final ungodly effort, you deliver what feels like a cannonball wrapped in slime. The baby emerges screaming like a drunken minstrel. The midwife catches it with the casual grace of someone catching a falling turnip. She immediately declares the sex, gives the child a quick inspection to make sure it has all the expected limbs, and slaps its bottom. Not for health, but for tradition and general medieval satisfaction. You're panting, sweating, possibly hallucinating St. Bridge, but you're alive, and somehow so is this tiny goo-covered red-faced person wailing in your arms. The cord is tied with linen thread. Eventually it will be cut using a knife that may or may not have recently been used to gut fish. But hey, antiseptic isn't invented yet, so what's the worst that could happen? You've done it. You've given birth in the Middle Ages and no one fainted, no one died yet. And your name will now be whispered with awe among the village women, unless the next baby comes in 13 months, in which case you'll be back on the stool sooner than you think. You've given birth, but there's no crying, no midwife declaring the sex, just silence. In medieval times, stillbirths are tragically common and terrifying, not only for emotional reasons, but spiritual ones. Because here's the catch. If your baby isn't baptized, their soul won't go to heaven. It might not even make it to purgatory. Instead, they end up in limbo, which is like a cosmic waiting room with no toys, no snacks, and no exit. Naturally, this causes panic. The midwife immediately shifts from calm birth attendant to emergency priest in training. She dashes for the holy water, or at least water someone once called holy. If there's none around, wine, river water, or spit will do in a pinch. The theology is flexible when salvation's on the line. If the baby shows even a hint of life, a twitch, a gasp, a noise resembling a hiccup, it's considered alive, just barely, which means you can baptize it. And they will instantly, often before the cord is even cut. In nomine Patrick, they mutter, urgently splashing a few drops on the baby's head. You're not even sure who's doing the baptizing anymore. The herbalist, a goat herder, your cousin, Mildred, doesn't matter. Anyone can perform a valid emergency baptism. Yes, even women. Yes, even illiterate ones. Salvation waits for no credentials. But what if the baby is clearly stillborn? Now you're entering theological bureaucracy. Some communities practice a desperate ritual called baptism of intention, essentially saying, "We meant to baptize them, God." Others believe in baptism by desire or even conditional baptism just in case the baby was secretly alive for half a second. Of course, the church debates all this endlessly as only medieval theologians can. Meanwhile, grieving mothers are left clutching bundles of silence, unsure whether to name their child or simply bury them under a tree and pray no one talks about it. You're exhausted, devastated, but the midwife, while solemn, is practical. She washes the baby, wraps it. If baptism was achieved, the infant is treated like a tiny saint. If not, well, the village priest will mutter something vague and hopeful during burial. It's the best they can offer, and somehow life in all its messy uncertainty goes on. Congratulations, you've just survived childbirth in the Middle Ages. This means you've earned a hot bowl of something vaguely edible, a weak prayer of gratitude, and now utter abandonment. Postpartum care in the medieval world is a bit like being handed a newborn and then shoved out the castle gates with a cheerful, "You'll figure it out," because while the birth was an all-hands-on-deck event with midwives, wise women, herbalists, and at least one curious, chicken aftera is less organized. You're bleeding sore and probably running a fever. The midwife has packed up her talismans and goose feathers and is already halfway to another village. Your husband is now more interested in celebrating the new heir, Reed, drinking heavily with his brothers, than checking on your stitches, which by the way don't exist. There is no concept of pelvic rest, no lactation consultant, no soothing ice packs, just linen cloths, herbal compresses of unknown origin, and the hope that your uterus knows what it's doing. Oh, and let's not forget your other children. Yes, those sticky, plague-ridden bundles of joy. They still need feeding, dressing, and yelling at, ideally by you, because the village doesn't pause for a postpartum nap. You've got chores. Sheep don't milk themselves after all. Feeling faint from blood loss, that's normal. Experiencing melancholy, that's demons. If you cry too much or seem distant, the priest might be called to sprinkle you. If that doesn't work, it's probably because you didn't pray hard enough during labor. Again, best of luck. In some communities, there's a churching ritual, a formal purification to let you return to society because obviously childbirth made you spiritually unclean. Until then, you're basically in quarantine, but without the luxury of being left alone. You might get a few gifts, bread, maybe some cheese, possibly a second-hand baby blanket someone found in a chest. No casseroles, no flowers, definitely no congratulatory Instagram post. The baby gets all the attention. You get back to work. Your recovery plan is simple. Don't die. If you can manage that, you're doing better than at least 30% of your peers. You've bled, screamed, torn, emotionally or otherwise, and survived the battlefield that is medieval childbirth. Surely now you get a reward. Perhaps a feast, a long nap, a warm bath. No, what you get is churching. Roughly 40 days after giving birth, assuming you haven't died, been accused of witchcraft, or become a ghost, it's time for your spiritual hygiene check. According to church doctrine, you are ritually impure because of all that messy, mortal, womanly bleeding you did. Not sinful per se, just icky. And so, your local priest will now perform a delightful public ceremony to cleanse your soul and officially welcome you back into the holy and socially acceptable fold. Think of it as a medieval re-entry permit. You dress in your best, try to hide how utterly exhausted you still are, and walk to the church or hobble, depending on how things healed. You might carry a candle not for symbolism, but to avoid being mistaken for a ghost. Once inside, the priest recites a few prayers. He thanks God that you, a vessel of both life and problematic fluids, did not die in the act of creating another soul. Then, and only then, are you allowed to enter the sacred parts of the church again? Yes, that's right. You've been banned from church for over a month. Because birth makes you spiritually radioactive, the ceremony is quick, awkward, and a little insulting. But hey, at least you get to sit down without anyone whispering about your unclean presence. It's also your first real social outing since childbirth, so you smile through the nonsense, nod during the psalms, and pretend the whole thing isn't just a sanctified version of go wash your hands. Some women, ironically, look forward to churching. Not for the purity, but because it means they can leave the house without being accused of tempting demons or spoiling the crops with their aura. Afterward, you're a free woman again, free to go to mass, free to walk in the marketplace, and tragically free to become pregnant again. The cycle has been reset. God has forgiven your uterus. The villagers stop side-eyeing you, and you can now touch holy water without anyone hissing. Progress. You've named the baby, baptized it, and you've even managed a few hours of sleep that didn't involve hallucinating Saint Margaret riding a goat. You might be thinking, we made it. Not so fast. In medieval times, infant mortality wasn't just common, it was expected. Roughly 1 in 3 babies never made it past their first year. Your village might have more tiny graves than living toddlers, and you'll quickly learn why most people didn't bother stitching the baby's name into anything until the 2nd birthday. That adorable little bundle currently drooling on your arm. He's up against a gauntlet of hazards. Fevers, dysentery, pneumonia, plague, starvation, and whatever was floating in the family well that day. And of course teething, which the church hadn't yet labeled a mortal danger. But every mother knew could still take a child. You do what you can. You swaddle. You breastfeed. You pray to St. Anne, St. Margaret, St. Bridge. Really, anyone who might have pulled with the celestial childcare department. You keep the fire going, tuck dried herbs under the cradle, and ward off evil spirits with an iron nail hammered into the doorframe. Because if death doesn't get your baby, the fairies might. Yes, some believe that sickly infants aren't sick. They've been swapped. A healthy baby stolen by woodland creatures and replaced with a changeling. Solutions vary. You might leave the baby overnight on a dung heap to scare the fairies off, or hold them over fire while reciting the Lord's Prayer. It's not medicine, but hey, it's medieval parenting. If your baby dies, you'll bury them quietly. There are no grief counselors, no casseroles, just a small wooden marker and a whisper to the priest. If the child was baptized, you can take some comfort knowing they're now in heaven. If not, well, the theology's murkier, and yet somehow families keep trying. You might name the next child the same as the last, recycling names like hand-me-down shoes. No one blinks. Grief is so woven into the fabric of life that it's practically embroidery. So yes, don't get too attached, but do, because love is defiant, even when the odds are laughably unfair. And in the medieval world, surviving infancy is the real miracle. Welcome to the next phase of medieval motherhood. Feeding the baby, also known as attempting to keep the tiny human alive using 2 leaky, unregulated medieval devices strapped to your chest. If you're lucky, your milk comes in. If not, you're already behind on medieval. Parenting's impossible checklist. Breastfeeding is the default, but it's also something of a gamble, like trying to churn butter with anxiety and no sleep. You try. You really do. You sit by the hearth, baby latched maybe. Midwife shouting advice like a medieval lactation coach with no formal training, but plenty of opinions. Rub goose fat on the nipples. Avoid cold bread. Pray to St. Agatha. She had her breast removed, so she'll understand. Some days it works. Other days the baby wails and your breasts feel like stone, which brings us to wet nurses. If you're a noble woman, or just very desperate and have a few coins to spare, you may outsource your milk supply. Wet nurses are women who've recently given birth themselves and now serve as professional human bottles. This arrangement is both practical and fraught with class-based tension, jealousy, and a strong scent of goat. Hiring a wet nurse comes with rules. She must not have sex. It'll spoil the milk. She must not eat garlic. Same reason. And she definitely mustn't get too attached to your baby because heaven forbid someone show consistent affection. She's basically the Uber Eats of the feudal era, but with moral warnings from the church and far more saliva. If you're not rich, you might try animal milk. Cow, goat, or in one ill-fated case, pig. But without refrigeration or sterilization. It's really just an elegant way to invite dysentery into the cradle. Feeding schedules, there aren't any. You feed when the baby cries or when your breasts start leaking through your only shmees. Growth charts don't exist. You eyeball it. He seems less shriveled than yesterday is about as scientific as it gets. And let's not even begin to discuss weaning. That's a whole separate gamble involving GRL chewed bread and occasionally wine-soaked cloth. Still, if your baby is gaining weight, breathing steadily, and not vomiting up demons, you're probably winning. You've survived childbirth, avoided infection, navigated wet nurses and ghost babies, and even been officially uncleaned by the church. Surely now you can enjoy a few peaceful years of parenting. Absolutely not. Because this is the Middle Ages, and your uterus is seen less as a personal organ and more as a communal production facility. You are expected to conceive again soon, preferably before you've even fully healed from the last one. There is no concept of family planning unless you count the family planning to just hope for a boy this time. Contraception, when it exists, ranges from unreliable to flat-out disturbing. Things like sheep intestines, bitter herbs, or vague prayers to saints who are notably not gynecologists. Your husband, meanwhile, has been very patient. A full 40 days of abstinence while you were ritually impure. And now, he's ready to resume his noble duties, which mostly involves lying down and contributing approximately 30 seconds of effort to the next potential heir. You, on the other hand, just managed to stop leaking from all available body parts, and were really hoping for a year off, maybe a pilgrimage or a nap. But no, the clock has reset, and your fertility is once again the village's favorite topic. If you're lucky, you'll go a few months without quickening. That's the medieval euphemism for fetal movement, not an enchanted Highlander jewel. But don't get too comfortable. Statistically, you'll be pregnant again within 18 months. Your midwife is already making mental notes. The priest's eyes twitch every time you walk into church as if he's wondering how soon he'll be sprinkling holy water on another screaming red blob. And your older children are now being trained to help raise their future siblings. Because that's what siblings are for, free labor and funeral attendance. You've entered the rhythm of medieval motherhood, a dance between diapers, death, and divine forgiveness. And there's no exit until menopause or plague. And yet, despite the pain, danger, and absolutely bonkers medical advice, you press on. Maybe because of faith, maybe because of love, or maybe because it's the 14th century and there's not much else to do. Either way, the cycle begins again. Cue the ominous lute music. You're exhausted, stitched, sore, and vaguely sticky. But somehow there's a baby in your arms. A real living one, breathing, squirming, screaming like it owns the place. And despite everything, the herbs, the prayers, the curses, the blood, the unhelpful menfolk standing outside is here, alive. And that's a miracle. Because in the Middle Ages, childbirth was a bit like medieval dice. You rolled and you hoped not to land on death by fever, breech horror, or possession by womb spirits. The church might have said it was divine providence, but any woman who survived it knew better. This was survival against all odds, stitched together with instinct and sheer stubbornness. The midwife, bless her sharp elbows, pats your head like a proud blacksmith inspecting her finest horseshoe. The priest offers a half smile, clearly unsure whether to say congratulations or thank God you're not dead. You glance down at this red squishy creature and think, how on earth do I keep you alive? You have no manuals, no pediatricians, no baby monitors, just intuition, breast milk, and an ancient talisman dangling near the cradle to keep demons at bay. Parenting, but medieval edition. And yet, something inside you knows you'll try again and again. Because even though your world is filled with mud, firewood, and diseases, with names that sound like tavern curses, this tiny heartbeat changes everything. It's hope bundled in linen, a future wrapped in mashed peas and potential. Soon the neighbors will arrive with bread, superstitions, and unsolicited advice. The wet nurse will show up. You'll be told to avoid eels, butter, strong emotions, and songs in minor key. All for the baby's health, of course. You'll try to make sense of it. But for now, in this flickering half-light, you breathe. You cradle. You cry a little. Because for all the superstition and sorrow, you made it. And if someone asks you how it felt, really felt, you'll never quite have the words. Because in a world where everything is dangerous and nothing is guaranteed, birth wasn't just a process. It was a rebellion. A miracle. Every time. Picture yourself in the middle of the 19th century. You're standing in the heart of Manchester or Birmingham, and the world smells like coal smoke and damp wool. The Industrial Revolution has locked you into a routine of 12-hour shifts, smog-choked skies, and streets so filthy that the idea of fresh air feels like a myth. For most working families, leisure doesn't exist until one piece of technology changes everything: the railway. When railroads spread across Britain, they didn't just move coal and steel, they moved people. And for the first time, they moved ordinary people. Before the railway age, the seaside was the exclusive playground of the wealthy aristocrats who had been told by their doctors that sea bathing could cure everything from gout to melancholy. They traveled in horse-drawn coaches to coastal towns like Brighton, staying in elegant villas and sipping mineral water as if it were liquid gold. But trains democratized the shoreline. Suddenly, a factory worker with a week's wages in his pocket could pack up the family, hop on a carriage, and by the afternoon be staring at the endless horizon of the English Channel. Brighton was the first star of this new leisure culture, thanks in no small part to the Prince Regent, later King George IV, who had turned the town into his playground decades earlier with the exotic Onion Royal Pavilion. But now, Brighton's beaches weren't just for the fashionable elite. Blackpool soon followed, transforming from a quiet fishing village into the mecca of mass seaside holidays. By the 1850s, it was lined with piers, dance halls, and the famous Blackpool Tower, an Eiffel Tower imitation with more donkey rides than Paris could ever dream of. What's remarkable is how quickly the seaside went from medicine to fun. At first, Victorians still clung to the belief that sea air was medicinal, that salt water could cleanse not just the body, but the soul. But when you give working families sunshine, ice cream, and a chance to escape the choking city, something magical happens. The seasides became a release valve for the pressures of industrial life, a place where children could run wild, men could loosen their collars, and women could finally breathe without inhaling coal dust. The seaside holiday was born not in the mansions of the aristocracy, but in the steam and smoke of the railway age. And Britain would never look at leisure the same way again. Once trains made the coast accessible, seaside towns were transformed almost overnight. Places that had been sleepy fishing villages or modest spa towns suddenly found themselves overrun with day trippers, weekend families, and vacationing clerks eager to trade soot for salt air. Entrepreneurs wasted no time. They built piers that stretched dramatically into the sea, not just as docking platforms, but as playgrounds lined with tea rooms, arcades, concert halls, and even small theaters. A stroll down the pier became as much a part of the holiday ritual as paddling in the surf. Blackpool is the perfect example of this transformation. Before the railway, it was little more than a cluster of cottages on the Lancashire coast. But once the tracks connected it to the industrial towns of northern England, Blackpool reinvented itself. By the 1870s, it boasted the famous North Pier, followed by Central and South Piers, each adding its own blend of entertainment, brass bands, fortune tellers, and even early amusement rides. Eventually, the iconic Blackpool Tower would rise, modeled after Paris's Eiffel Tower, dominating the skyline and drawing in millions of visitors. Brighton too leaned into its royal glamour. It had long basked in the glow of George IV's royal pavilion, but now it became a fashionable hub for both the wealthy and the working classes. Its promenade bustled with visitors in their Sunday best, women in long dresses with parasols and men tipping their hats, while vendors shouted about oysters, sweets, and seaside souvenirs. For Victorians, these resorts represented something new: leisure as a commodity. This was the first time entire towns were built not for work, not for worship, but for play. Everything was designed to entertain, distract, and delight. Families could rent a modest boarding house, eat fish and chips wrapped in paper, and feel for a few days like they belonged to a different world. The strict rules of industrial life, the bell of the factory, the relentless hours gave way to a more playful rhythm of donkey rides, seaside bands, and ice cream eaten before dinner. And perhaps, most importantly, seaside resorts gave Victorians something they had never really experienced before: the idea of escape, a physical and psychological break from the grind of their everyday existence. Whether for a day trip or a fortnight, the seaside holiday created a new culture of fun, one that promised refreshment, laughter, and just a touch of sand in your shoes. If there's one image that sums up Victorian seaside culture, it's the bathing machine. These odd little wooden huts on wheels looked a bit like oversized garden sheds, except they were designed to roll straight into the sea. Why? Because Victorians had an obsession with modesty that extended even to splashing in the waves. For women in particular, bathing in public was a delicate matter. Society demanded that female bodies remain hidden. Yet doctors and holiday guides swore by the health benefits of sea bathing. The solution, a horse or sometimes sheer manpower, would haul the bathing machine down the sand and into the shallows. Inside, a woman could discreetly change into her voluminous bathing costume, which looked more like a layered dress than swimwear. When ready, she would step out directly into the water, shielded from curious onlookers by the structure itself. Some bathing machines were luxurious, outfitted with steps, handrails, and even curtains to ensure maximum discretion. Others were little more than rickety boxes. For men, the rules were looser. At some resorts, they were allowed to strip down to the waist and run straight into the waves. But even then, Victorian etiquette usually demanded some form of modest costume. The days of modern bikinis were, needless to say, still a century away. The real enforcers of seaside morality were the so-called dippers. These attendants, often strong women in coastal towns, helped guide bathers into the surf, sometimes quite literally dragging them into the waves for maximum invigoration. To a Victorian bather, the cold shock of the sea was believed to jolt the system into better health. To us, it probably felt more like punishment. Bathing machines soon became iconic features of every respectable beach. In Brighton, Scarborough and Blackpool, they lined the shores like caravans at a festival. Holiday makers accepted them not just as practical, but as essential. Without them, the whole notion of a family-friendly seaside outing would have been scandalous. Of course, the strictness of the rules began to loosen by the late Victorian era. Resorts that catered to working-class families were more relaxed, and young people soon found ways to flirt, splash, and enjoy the waves beyond the eyes of propriety. Still, the bathing machine stands as a perfect symbol of Victorian seaside life, half leisure, half repression, and fully peculiar. No Victorian seaside holiday was complete without a stomach full of sugary delights and a turn on the sand with a donkey. Resorts quickly realized that fresh air alone wouldn't keep people entertained, so they filled the beach with food stalls, novelty rides, and treats that became synonymous with summer. Ice cream, for example, was a true sensation. The credit often goes to Carlo Gatti, a Swiss-Italian immigrant who helped popularize the idea of serving ices to the masses. Previously, chilled desserts had been luxuries reserved for the wealthy, since ice itself had to be cut from frozen lakes and stored in insulated ice houses. But by the mid-9th century, better transport and the clever use of ice imports meant that a humble factory worker could hand his child a penny lick. Literally, a small glass dish of ice cream meant to be licked clean and returned. Health regulations weren't exactly a thing yet. Hygiene was optional, but the thrill of cold sweetness on a hot day was unforgettable. And then there were donkey rides. Imagine being a child from the industrial north, stepping onto a sandy beach for the first time. The sea looks endless, the horizon impossible, and then someone offers you the chance to climb onto a small, slightly grumpy donkey and plod along the shoreline. It was the highlight of countless Victorian children's holidays. Donkey rides became so iconic that postcards from Blackpool, Brighton and Skara often featured rows of donkeys in their tacky saddles waiting for eager riders. Other treats included sticks of rock candy, hard sugar sweets with the resort's name spelled right through the middle, and oysters, which at the time were cheap street food rather than luxury dining. Vendors pushed carts along the promenade, hawking gingerbread, fish and chips and peanuts. The seaside became a carnival of tastes and smells, a place where even a modest family could afford a little indulgence. Of course, the moral guardians weren't always pleased. Religious critics sometimes muttered that seaside fun distracted workers from their duties or encouraged idleness. But for the families trudging home, sunburnt and sticky-fingered, those donkey rides and ice creams weren't moral lapses. They were memories. The Victorian seaside was built not just on the promise of health and sea air, but on the sheer joy of simple pleasures, sweet, salty, sandy, and just a little bit silly. If the beach was the stage, then the pier was the theater of the Victorian seaside. These wooden structures reached dramatically into the sea, offering not only a place to promenade, but also a hub of entertainment that defined the holiday experience. Walking out onto a pier wasn't just about the view. It was about entering a different world, one where the only purpose was pleasure. The first piers were simple walkways, giving visitors a chance to stroll above the water and catch a cool breeze. But it didn't take long for entrepreneurs to realize that piers were prime real estate for amusements. Soon they were lined with tea rooms, concert halls, penny arcades, and even small theaters where comic singers and music hall performers entertained the crowds. In some resorts, brass bands played daily, filling the air with jaunty tunes, as children tugged at their parents' sleeves for another sweet or a turn at the hoopla stalls. Blackpool led the way with its North Pier in 1863, later followed by Central and South Piers. Each had its own distinct personality. The North was elegant, appealing to middle-class families who wanted refinement with their sea air. The Central was noisier, packed with shows and rides, and the South embraced spectacle with dancing and variety acts. Brighton's West Pier and Palace Pier soon became equally famous, drawing throngs of holidaymakers eager for seaside glamour. The pier was also the perfect place for people watching. Victorians loved a good promenade. Men and women dressed in their finest holiday clothes would walk slowly up and down, exchanging nods and glances as though the pier were one long catwalk. A seaside stroll could lead to flirtation, gossip, or simply the joy of being seen. For working families, the pier represented something radical, a space where everyone was invited. You didn't need to be wealthy to enjoy the brass band or the comic routines. A penny could buy you laughter, a memory, or at least a sticky bag of toffee. The seaside pier turned leisure into something collective, where the classes mingled, boundaries blurred, and the waves below kept up their endless applause. In short, the pier was where Victorian Britain learned how to have fun together. Sunburn, silly songs and all. For Victorians, the seaside wasn't just about fun. It was also about health. In fact, the whole seaside craze began with doctors recommending salt water and sea air as miracle cures. Long before donkey rides and sticks of rock candy, the beach was a kind of outdoor hospital. Physicians claimed that a plunge into the cold waves could strengthen the constitution, clear the lungs, and even calm the nerves. Parents were told to bring sickly children to the coast, convinced the bracing winds could restore weak bodies. But this medical angle was always entangled with morality. A seaside holiday had to be respectable. That meant strict rules on how one behaved on the beach. Men and women were often segregated into different bathing areas. Even walking along the promenade came with a code of conduct. Ladies with parasols, men in suits, no bare skin except for hands and faces. Resorts wanted to attract families, not scandal. And yet the seaside also tempted people to relax social rules. It was one of the few places where men and women of different classes might mingle in the same space, united by a craving for sunshine and a paddle in the sea. For religious reformers and moral watchdogs, this was alarming. Some sermons thundered that seaside resorts encourage frivolity, vanity, and even sin. Young couples strolling along the pier or sharing a bag of sweets were viewed with suspicion, as if sugar and sea spray could lead to moral collapse. Still, for most Victorians, the seaside cure was both physical and emotional. Escaping the smoke-filled towns, feeling the sun on their faces, and hearing the crash of waves was a kind of therapy. Even if the medical claims were exaggerated, the relief was real. Families returned home healthier in spirit, if not in body, ready to face the grind of factory life once more. In this way, the seaside became a strange blend of doctor's prescription and family playground. It promised both virtue and indulgence, a place where you could heal your lungs with salt air but also ruin your teeth with peppermint rock. And perhaps that paradox was exactly why it worked. Victorian Britain was obsessed with class, and nowhere was this more visible than at the seaside. The train may have opened the coast to everyone, but how you experienced it depended entirely on your place in the social hierarchy. For the upper and middle classes, the seaside was an opportunity to display refinement. They stayed in elegant hotels, rented well-furnished houses, and promenaded in carefully tailored clothes. At Brighton, the fashionable could still bask in the aura of royal patronage, strolling past the onion domes of the pavilion or enjoying exclusive concerts. The pier for them was a place to be seen as much as to see, an outdoor stage where appearance mattered. Working-class families, by contrast, had a very different holiday. They might cram into cheap boarding houses, sleep several to a room, and eat simple meals of bread, cheese, and fish bought from street vendors. Their leisure was louder and more physical. Donkey rides for the children, fairground amusements, and dancing in packed halls. Blackpool became their capital, offering entertainment that didn't require deep pockets. For many factory workers, just walking barefoot on sand was luxury enough. Naturally, the classes sometimes rubbed shoulders, and not always comfortably. Middle-class visitors complained about the rowdiness of working-class holidaymakers. Too much drinking, too much singing, too much laughter. But there was no escaping the fact that the seaside was one of the few spaces where class barriers softened. A clerk and a mill worker might both ride the same donkey or lick the same sticky ice cream. The waves at least didn't care about social rank. Yet resorts also learned to separate clientele. Some beaches designated specific areas, quiet zones for the well-to-do, livelier, stretches for the masses. Boarding houses advertised themselves as respectable, a coded term meaning no working-class lodges. Even the piers developed identities, refined promenades for some, noisy arcades for others. Still, the seaside hinted at a new kind of social mixing. For a brief holiday week, families who rarely left their industrial towns found themselves alongside lawyers, doctors, and merchants, all chasing the same sea air. It wasn't equality, but it was proximity. And for Victorian Britain, that alone was remarkable. The seaside was both a mirror of class divides and a rare space where they could blur, however awkwardly, under the glare of the summer sun. For Victorian children, the seaside was nothing short of paradise. At home, their lives were often cramped and disciplined. In the factory towns, streets were dirty, play was limited, and fresh air was scarce. But on the beach, suddenly there was space to run, water to splash in, and an endless supply of sand waiting to be molded into castles. For many working-class children, their first sight of the ocean was a revelation, an adventure that etched itself into memory forever. Donkey rides were, of course, a classic highlight. A penny or two could buy a child a slow, wobbly trot along the sands, clutching the reins as though commanding a mighty steed. Donkeys became such icons of the Victorian seaside that families often posed for photographs beside them, proof that their little ones had truly done the seaside. And when not on donkey back, children scurried about with tin buckets and wooden spades, digging mows or attempting ambitious sand fortresses destined to collapse with the tide. But it wasn't all innocent play. Parents and guardians often viewed the beach as a kind of natural nursery, a place where children could be toughened up. See, bathing was prescribed for even the youngest, with mothers and dippers dunking squirming toddlers into the icy surf in the name of health. The screams may not have sounded joyful, but Victorians were convinced that the shock of salt water was good for a child's constitution. Entertainment tailored to children soon flourished. Punch and Judy puppet shows became seaside staples with their slapstick violence and shrill voices drawing laughter from crowds of little ones. Vendors sold sticks of rock candy and gingerbread men. Small luxuries that turned sticky fingers and smiling faces into permanent seaside memories. Middle and upper class children meanwhile experienced the beach differently. Their play was more supervised, their bathing costumes more elaborate, and their amusements more gentile, pony rides, promenades, or carefully planned excursions with tutors and governesses. Still, the magic of the seaside cut across class lines. Whether building sandcastles or clutching an ice cream, children discovered freedom at the shore that simply didn't exist back home. The seaside in many ways redefined childhood for the Victorians. It offered play, health, and escape all rolled into one. For parents, it was therapy. For children, it was wonder. And together these families helped shape the seaside into the playground of a nation. By the time Queen Victoria's reign drew to a close in 1901, the seaside holiday had gone from an eccentric medical ritual to a cornerstone of British culture. What had begun as a doctor's prescription and a royal fad had transformed into a national tradition. one that would shape leisure for generations. The railways were key. They didn't just connect towns to beaches, they connected people to the very idea of escape. For the first time, working-class families experienced leisure as something they could buy, not just dream about. Blackpool, Brighton, Skara, and countless smaller resorts thrived because they offered the same promise: a temporary break from the grinding routine of industrial life. The infrastructure built in this period also left a permanent mark. The piers, promenades, and pavilions of the Victorian age became icons of the British coast. Blackpool Tower, Brighton Pier, and the grand hotels of Skara still stand today as reminders of a time when holiday making was both spectacle and necessity. Even the humble bathing machine, long obsolete, survives in postcards, paintings, and museum exhibits, symbols of Victorian modesty and eccentricity rolled into one. More importantly, Victorian seaside holidays reshaped attitudes toward family life, leisure, and health. They made play legitimate. They taught a nation that taking time away from work wasn't laziness. It was refreshment. For children, they created magical memories of sand, donkeys, and ice cream. For adults, they offered a glimpse of freedom, even if only for a week. Of course, the seaside would continue to evolve in the 20th century. Amusement parks, cinemas, and later cheap overseas flights would change holiday culture forever. But the Victorian foundations remained. Without the railway day trippers and donkey rides, there would be no Butlins camps, no package holidays, no cheap flights to Spain. The DNA of the modern holiday traces straight back to Brighton's promenades and Blackpool's piers. Today, when families still head to the beach for a weekend of sandcastles and fish and chips, they are echoing a ritual invented more than a century and a half ago. The Victorian seaside holiday was more than a moment of leisure. It was a revolution in how ordinary people thought about life, work, and joy. And that legacy still lingers with every stick of rock and every squeal of gulls above the shore. For the Apache, health was never simply about the body. It was a matter of living in harmony with the land, the spirits, the ancestors, and the community. To be healthy was to be in balance, and to fall ill was to have drifted out of step with that delicate order. The Apache understood life as an interconnected web where the physical, spiritual, and emotional threads were all tightly woven together. Target one thread through misfortune, wrongdoing, or even an encounter with hostile spiritual forces, and the whole web could unravel. Illness, therefore, was not just a fever or an injury. It was a sign that balance had been disturbed. A hunter who disrespected the animal he killed might find himself plagued with weakness. A family that quarreled endlessly might bring sickness into their home. Even dreams could warn that the spirit was uneasy and that healing was needed before the trouble grew worse. For the Apache, every sickness had both a visible cause and an invisible one, and both needed attention. The land itself played a central role in this philosophy. Mountains, rivers, animals, and plants were not seen as background scenery, but as living relatives, each with its own spirit. To harm nature carelessly was to wound oneself. To treat the earth with respect was to invite her healing powers. This meant that healing could never be confined to a single patient. It was a communal and environmental effort, a restoration of the larger balance in which the individual lived. At the heart of this worldview stood the medicine men, guardians of harmony and interpreters of imbalance. They were not only healers of the body but also mediators between the human and spirit worlds. When illness struck, people sought their guidance not just for a cure but for an understanding. Why has this happened? What must be done to restore balance? This perspective shaped every healing practice that followed, whether through herbs, chants, sand paintings, or ceremonies. The true goal was never only to ease pain or fight disease. It was to mend the broken threads, to bring the individual back into alignment with the community, the earth, and the unseen world. For the Apache, healing was not a quick fix. It was a journey back into harmony, a reminder that health was not owned but shared. In Apache tradition, the medicine man was more than a healer. He was a spiritual guide, counselor, and protector of the community. His role combined the duties of a doctor, a priest, and a storyteller. Yet it went even deeper. He was the one entrusted with knowledge passed down through generations. knowledge of herbs, chants, and ceremonies that maintained the balance of life itself. Becoming a medicine man was not a casual choice. It required years of apprenticeship, learning from elders who carefully selected their students. Apprenticeship was long and rigorous, involving memorization of sacred chants, understanding the spiritual significance of each herb, and mastering rituals that demanded precision. Every gesture, every word, every symbol had meaning. A mistake could lessen the power of a ceremony, or worse, invite harm instead of healing. Medicine men were also chosen for their calling. Sometimes a vision or dream signaled that an individual was destined for this path. Illness or a brush with death could also mark someone as spiritually gifted, believed to have touched the world of the spirits and returned with new insight. From that moment, their life became dedicated to serving others. Their responsibilities extended far beyond the sick room. A medicine man might be asked to bless a hunting party, protect warriors before battle, or preside over ceremonies marking life's milestones. He maintained the songs and stories that linked the Apache to their ancestors and to the natural world. His chants weren't simply words. They were bridges between realms, calls to the spirit forces that governed health and harmony. The community placed immense trust in medicine men, yet they carried heavy burdens. Healing was not always guaranteed, and failure could bring doubt or blame. Still, the medicine man was a central figure, embodying both hope and continuity. His presence reminded people that sickness, loss, or fear were never faced alone. There was always someone standing between them and the unseen, striving to bring balance back. In the Apache worldview, medicine men were not miracle workers in the Western sense. They were guardians of tradition, channels of sacred knowledge, and keepers of balance. Their power came not from themselves, but from their ability to align human life with the greater harmony of the universe. Among the Apache, the natural world was not just a backdrop. It was a pharmacy, a sacred storehouse of medicine. Every plant, root, and mineral had potential power, and the knowledge of how to use them was carefully preserved by medicine men and women. Healing the body often began with healing herbs gathered respectfully from the land. Plants were chosen not only for their physical properties, but also for their spiritual associations. For example, sage was used to cleanse and purify both in body and in spirit. Juniper berries could treat stomach troubles, but were also burned to ward off negative forces. Yucca, a plant with deep roots in Apache daily life, provided soap, shampoo, and pickases for wounds. Each plant was seen as a living ally with its own spirit, deserving of gratitude and care when harvested. Preparation of these remedies was never casual. Herbs might be brewed into teas, ground into powders, or applied as pickases to the skin, but they were rarely administered alone. A medicine man would often combine them with prayer, song, or ritual, ensuring that the treatment worked on both the physical and spiritual levels. Healing was never considered complete unless both body and spirit were addressed together. The act of gathering the herbs was itself part of the ceremony. Plants were often collected at certain times of day or specific phases of the moon in locations believed to hold particular power. Offerings such as a pinch of cornmeal or a whispered prayer were left as thanks. This reciprocity underscored a key Apache belief. Taking medicine from the earth required respect and balance, not exploitation. What might strike outsiders as folk remedies were in fact part of a sophisticated system of knowledge. Generations of observation, trial, and spiritual practice informed which plant healed which ailment. And while Western medicine often dismissed such traditions as superstition, many of these herbs did indeed contain healing compounds later discovered by science. But for the Apache, the plants were never merely chemicals. They were living partners in the act of healing. And to use them without prayer or respect was to miss the point entirely. Healing with herbs was not just about curing sickness, it was about restoring harmony between humans and the natural world. In Apache healing, words were never just words. Spoken or sung with intention, they became medicine in their own right. Chants and sacred songs were believed to carry power, bridges between the human and the spiritual realms. To heal the body, the spirit had to be called into harmony, and chants were the language that made this possible. A healing chant was not improvised. Each song was part of a carefully preserved tradition passed down through generations of medicine men. Some chants lasted only a few minutes, while others could extend through long ceremonies, unfolding in rhythmic patterns that mirrored the cycles of nature. The Faiz Alais, rising of the sun, the phases of the moon, the flowing of rivers. The words themselves were often combined with sounds that imitated the natural world. Bird calls, rustling winds, the steady beat of a drum echoing a heartbeat. Chants were used for different purposes. Some were prayers for protection, sung before hunts or battles. Others were designed to cure specific ailments, calling upon spiritual forces to drive out sickness. Still others were ceremonial, tied to major rituals like the sunrise dance, which marked a girl's passage into womanhood and was filled with songs celebrating renewal and strength. Importantly, these chants weren't just performed to the patient. They involved the community. Families and friends might join in, reinforcing the sense that healing was not an individual struggle, but a collective act of support. To hear the chant was to be reminded that one was not alone in illness, but surrounded by harmony in sound. The power of these songs was amplified by belief. The Apache understood that words shaped a reality. To speak was to call something into being. A chant wasn't magic in the sense of tricks, but in the sense of alignment. It ordered the world, set things right. Combined with herbs, sand paintings, or ritual acts, chants were the thread that tied all parts of healing together. Even today, many Apache songs endure. They continue to be sung at ceremonies, carrying forward the same conviction that sound, rhythm, and sacred words can restore balance. In the Apache worldview, too, heal with song is to remind the body, the spirit, and the community that they are one. Among the Apache, healing was never just about herbs and chants. It was also about images. Sand paintings created with colored powders of crushed stone, pollen, charcoal, and clay became sacred tools in ceremonies designed to restore balance. They were not decorative art in the modern sense, but living prayers drawn upon the earth itself. A sand painting was usually made on the ground of a ceremonial lodge or an outdoor space prepared for ritual. Medicine men assisted by apprentices would carefully scatter colored sands to form intricate patterns of figures, animals, and sacred symbols. Every line, every shade carried meaning. These images represented the spiritual forces that governed health, holy beings, animals of power, and symbols of the four directions. By recreating these images, the healer invited these forces into the ritual, calling them to intervene in the patient's illness. The patient would often be placed directly upon the painting, seated or lying in its center. In this way, the image became a kind of spiritual map, placing the sick person within a restored order of the universe. Chants and prayers accompanied the act, activating the design and weaving it into the larger ceremony. What made sand paintings so powerful was their impermanence. Once the healing was complete, the painting was destroyed. Its sand brushed away or scattered to the wind. This act symbolized the transitory nature of sickness itself. Illness did not belong to the patient forever. It could be erased just as the image was. The destruction also ensured that the painting's sacred power could not be misused outside the ritual. The symbols themselves were drawn from Apache cosmology. Animals like the bear or eagle, sacred mountains, or the rainbow might appear, each bringing its own protective or healing influence. To outsiders, the paintings may have looked like abstract art, but to the Apache they were blueprints of harmony, diagrams of the cosmos in miniature. Through sand paintings, healing became visible. It was not only spoken in chants or tasted in herbs, but seen on the earth itself. The patient, the healer, and the community could witness balance being restored before their very eyes. For the Apache, true healing was rarely a private act. It unfolded in ceremony where the patient, the healer, and the entire community came together to restore balance. These rituals were more than treatments. They were sacred performances that bound people to each other and to the unseen, forces of the world. Ceremonies could last for hours or even days depending on the gravity of the illness or the purpose of the ritual. They combined song, prayer, dance, and symbolic acts, weaving together all the strands of Apache healing, herbs, sand paintings, chants into a single unified experience. The setting itself was carefully prepared. A ceremonial lodge or open-air space purified with smoke and aligned with the 4 sacred directions. Every detail mattered because every detail reflected the cosmic order that healing sought to restore. Central to these ceremonies was participation. Healing was not a passive experience where a patient simply received treatment. Instead, the patient became the focus of collective energy. Surrounded by family, friends, and fellow tribes, people who added their prayers and presence to the process. In this way, illness was addressed not as a private misfortune, but as a disruption that touched the entire community. When one person was out of harmony, everyone felt it. One of the most important ceremonies was the night chant, a ritual that invoked powerful holy beings to cleanse sickness and restore health. Another was the sunrise dance, often performed for young women coming of age, which symbolized renewal, fertility, and the strength of life. While not always strictly medical, these ceremonies underscored the Apache view that health was inseparable from life's major transitions and spiritual milestones. The ceremonies also carried immense psychological weight. The rhythm of the chants, the colors of the sand paintings, the collective beat of the drums, all created an atmosphere of awe and hope. For the patient, the experience was transformative, a reminder that they were supported not only by their people, but by the spirits themselves. Through ceremony, the Apache affirmed their most important truth. Healing was about more than curing the body. It was about restoring the circle of family, of community, of nature, and of spirit. To be healed was to be placed once more in harmony with all that existed. For the Apache, healing could never be separated from the land. Mountains, rivers, animals, and even the wind were considered living relatives, each with its own spirit. To be healthy meant being in balance with these forces, and illness often reflected a disruption in this relationship. Healing then required not only tending to the body, but also mending ties with the natural and spiritual worlds. Medicine men often led patients into sacred spaces, mountain foothills, riversides, or secluded groves, where the presence of nature itself was part of the cure. These places were chosen not at random, but because they were believed to be dwellings of holy beings or sites where spiritual energy was especially strong. To pray in such a place, surrounded by the voices of birds and the scent of herbs, was to step into a living sanctuary. Animals too were part of this balance. The eagle, for instance, symbolized strength and carried prayer skyward with its feathers. The bear was revered as a healer, its spirit called upon to grant endurance and power. Even smaller creatures like insects held lessons, reminders of persistence, adaptability, or community. By recognizing the wisdom in all beings, the Apache affirmed their place within a much larger circle of life. Ritual acts often reinforced this relationship. Offerings of cornmeal or pollen were made before harvesting medicinal plants, acknowledging that taking from the earth required giving back. Ceremonies invoked the 4 directions, east, south, west, and north, each representing a different aspect of life and health. By aligning with these forces, the healer restored harmony not only within the patient, but between the patient and the universe itself. This approach also emphasized humility. Humans were not masters of nature, but participants in a shared world. Illness was a sign that the balance of that world had been disturbed, whether through personal choices, community conflict, or even disrespect toward the land. Healing was therefore not about conquering disease, but about repairing relationships with self, with others, with the environment, and with the spirits that watched over all. Through this worldview, the Apache offered a profound lesson that true health is not an individual possession, but a state of harmony sustained by every living connection. In Apache culture, illness was never borne by the patient alone. Sickness was seen as a disruption of harmony that touched the entire community, and so healing became a collective responsibility. Family, friends, and neighbors all took part in the process, ensuring that the patient was supported physically, emotionally, and spiritually. When someone fell ill, their family gathered not just to care for their body, but to provide constant presence and encouragement. Food was prepared communally, children were watched by relatives, and prayers were offered in unison. This solidarity lessened the burden of illness, reminding the patient that they were woven into a living network of care. Healing was as much about restoring bonds with loved ones as it was about easing pain. Ceremonies amplified this sense of togetherness. When chants were sung or sand paintings made, it was rarely a solitary act. Dozens of voices might join in the songs, their rhythms carrying the patient's spirit upward. The entire community became part of the ritual, each participant lending their strength to the restoration of harmony. This shared energy created a powerful psychological and spiritual atmosphere, one where the patient knew that they were not battling sickness in isolation. Children too were included in these rituals. They learned by watching, listening, and participating, ensuring that the traditions of healing and support passed naturally from one generation to the next. To grow up in this environment was to understand that health was communal, not individualistic. The community's involvement also reflected Apache values of reciprocity. Just as one person's illness could unsettle the group, so too could their healing strengthen it. When a patient recovered, gratitude was expressed not only to the spirits and the medicine man, but also to those who had stood by them. This cycle of mutual support created resilience, reinforcing the idea that no one could truly be well unless the community itself was balanced. In many ways, this collective healing was the greatest medicine of all. While herbs soothed and chants aligned the spirit, it was the steady presence of kin and neighbors that reminded each person of their place in the circle of life. Health was not a private achievement, it was a gift shared by all. Although centuries have passed and modern medicine now dominates much of the world, Apache healing traditions continue to endure, adapted, preserved, and remembered as a vital part of cultural identity. These practices are not relics locked in the past, but living traditions that still guide many Apache families in how they view health, balance, and the world around them. The emphasis on harmony between body, spirit, nature, and community remains deeply relevant today. Many Apache people continue to turn to ceremonies, songs, and herbal remedies not only for healing, but also for maintaining spiritual strength in daily life. Even when hospitals and clinics are used for physical treatment, traditional practices often accompany them, ensuring that the spiritual side of illness is not neglected. This dual approach reflects a belief that Western and indigenous medicines can coexist, each addressing different layers of the human experience. Sand paintings, chants, and ceremonies are also preserved as part of cultural education. They are performed not only for healing, but for the teaching of younger generations. Each ritual becomes a classroom passing on stories, songs, and values that ensure continuity of Apache identity. The sunrise dance, for example, still stands as a powerful ceremony of renewal, tying together health, spirituality, and cultural pride. These traditions also speak to a broader audience beyond the Apache. In a world where modern medicine sometimes struggles to address mental health, loneliness, and the stresses of disconnection from nature, the Apache worldview offers an alternative perspective. It suggests that true healing requires more than medicine bottles and diagnosis. It requires belonging, respect for the environment, and a sense of harmony with forces larger than oneself. Despite centuries of displacement, hardship, and pressure to abandon their customs, the Apache have safeguarded their healing ways. Elders, medicine men, and cultural leaders continue to emphasize that these practices are not just alternative medicine, but an entire philosophy of life. They remind us that to be healed is not simply to survive, but to live in balance with the earth, with others, and with one's own spirit. The legacy of Apache healing endures as a testament to resilience. It carries forward the wisdom that health is not only a condition of the body, but a harmony of the whole, echoing across generations and reminding us all that balance is the truest medicine. In the medieval world, marriage was never just a private matter. Today we think of weddings as deeply personal, two people choosing to share their lives. But in the Middle Ages, a wedding was as much about families, land, alliances, and reputation as it was about love. And because marriage was treated as a public contract, so too was its most intimate moment, the wedding night. A marriage wasn't truly considered valid until it had been consummated. In other words, until the couple had physically sealed the deal. To modern ears, this might sound invasive, even absurd. But for medieval communities, sex on the wedding night was proof that the marriage existed in both body and law. Without consummation, a union could be annulled and property or inheritance rights thrown into question. The stakes were high, and so the act was ritualized, watched, and documented. In aristocratic households, the bedding ceremony was an essential part of the festivities. Guests often escorted the bride and groom to their chamber in a noisy procession filled with music, laughter, and bawdy jokes. Sometimes, relatives or attendants would literally tuck the couple into bed, pulling the covers up and offering blessings or teasing encouragement. In certain cases, witnesses were expected to remain in the room until the marriage was considered well and truly joined. Privacy was a luxury, and for newlyweds, it was often in very short supply. For peasants, the rituals were less formal but no less communal. Villagers might gather outside the bridal chamber, singing ribald songs or banging pots to mark the occasion. Fertility charms, herbs, amulets, or symbolic foods were often placed near the bed to ensure that the night was fruitful. Because children were the ultimate goal of marriage, the pressure to consummate quickly was enormous. The church too had its eyes on the wedding bed. Priests preached that sex within marriage was not sinful but blessed, provided it was done with the intent of producing children. Yet rules abounded. Certain holy days prohibited intercourse, and certain positions were discouraged as improper. Even behind closed doors, the act was tightly policed by moral and spiritual expectations. In short, the medieval wedding night was never just about two people exploring intimacy. It was a public ritualized event loaded with legal, religious, and social weight. The community had a stake in it, and the couple's first night together was treated less as a private memory and more as the final act of a binding contract. If there was one medieval ritual guaranteed to make the modern mind squirm, it was the bedding ceremony. For newlyweds, the first night together was less about whispered intimacy and more about being paraded, tucked in, and sometimes even observed by half the household. It was part comedy, part ritual, and very much a community event. In noble and royal weddings, the procession to the bedchamber was a performance in itself. Guests, often tipsy from hours of feasting, would accompany the couple through the halls with music, laughter, and teasing. Some sang board songs, others shouted jokes or offered fertility blessings, while attendants carried torches to light the way. In Aus, some regions, the bride's shoes or stockings were stolen, supposedly ensuring fertility, though it mostly ensured a raucous chase. Once inside the chamber, the real ritual began. The couple was often undressed by attendants, sometimes down to their linen shirts in full view of select witnesses. The bride was ceremoniously laid in bed first, followed by the groom, and the two were literally tucked in by friends and relatives. In aristocratic settings, bishops or high-ranking clergy sometimes gave a blessing over the bed itself, asking God to sanctify the union and grant children. Did people stay to watch what happened next? In some cases, yes. Particularly in royal or political marriages, witnesses might linger until they were satisfied that the couple was settled for the night. In extreme situations, usually to secure proof of consummation, trusted attendants remained until the act was, at least in part, completed. This was rare for ordinary folk, but crucial for dynasties, where legitimacy of heirs was everything. For common villages, the bedding ceremony was less formal, but no less noisy. Friends might escort the couple to their cottage while singing crude songs, banging pots, or throwing grain as a fertility charm. Privacy was still minimal. Neighbors might shout jokes through the window or sneak peeks to ensure the marriage was properly begun. To the medieval mind, all of this made perfect sense. Marriage was not private property, but a public contract, and the community had every right to ensure it was sealed. The bedding ceremony, however strange it appears to us, was seen as both protection and celebration. Protection against doubts about legitimacy and celebration of a union that bound two families, two fortunes, and hopefully the next generation. If the medieval wedding night was the grand finale of the day, then fertility was its headline act. The entire ritual of marriage revolved around producing children, and couples were surrounded, sometimes smothered, by charms, superstitions, and symbolic acts meant to guarantee that the bride's womb would not remain empty for long. One of the most common practices was the use of fertility foods. Guests might scatter wheat, oats, or barley on the marriage bed, symbols of abundance and new life. Bread and salt were also placed nearby to ward off bad luck and invite prosperity. Eggs, unsurprisingly, were associated with fertility, and in some regions brides ate them before the wedding night to ensure conception. Honey, with its sticky sweetness, was consumed in large amounts, so much so that the very word honeymoon reflects this ancient association with marital fertility. Amulets and herbs were another layer of protection. Brides sometimes wore charms stitched discreetly into their gowns or hidden in their jewelry. Rue, a bitter herb, was believed to protect against infertility and the evil eye, while rosemary was used to strengthen love and memory. In some households, sprigs of juniper or yarrow were tucked under the bed, said to encourage both passion and fertility. Superstitions extended even to timing. Certain nights were considered more auspicious for consummation, while others, especially those falling on holy days or during Lent, were strictly avoided. To ignore these rules was to risk misfortune, not just for the couple, but for the children they might one day have. The church reinforced this idea, preaching that sex had to be carefully ordered, even within marriage. The community, never far away also, played its part in these superstitions. Friends and neighbors might place charms on the bedchamber door or sing songs filled with references to fertility. Some even pelted the bridal couple with nuts or seeds, both fertility symbols, as they were led to bed. Privacy was minimal, but encouragement was abundant. For medieval couples, these traditions were not seen as optional or quaint. They were essential. Failure to follow them risked more than social embarrassment. It risked childlessness, a devastating outcome in a world where lineage, labor, and survival all depended on children being born. In the flickering torchlight of a medieval bridal chamber, fertility wasn't just hoped for, it was engineered with charms, foods, and rituals meant to make sure the marriage bed did what it was meant to do. In medieval Europe, no aspect of marriage escaped the gaze of the church, and the wedding night was no exception. While villages and noble households had their fertility charms and raucous bedding rituals, the church insisted on being the ultimate authority in defining what counted as proper consummation. To them, sex within marriage was not only a private act, but a sacred duty. The church's stance was clear. The purpose of marital sex was procreation. Pleasure for its own sake was frowned upon, and any act that strayed from this reproductive mission was labeled sinful. Priests preached sermons that spelled out the rules of marital intimacy. Certain days of the week and liturgical seasons such as Lent, Advent, or major feast days were strictly off limits. To break these taboos was to risk spiritual punishment, even if it meant delaying consummation. Even the mechanics of the act were policed. The missionary position with the man on top was preached as the only acceptable method, as it was thought to reflect natural order. Other positions were condemned as improper or even against nature. Manuals circulated among clerics described in startling detail what couples could and could not do in bed. While it's doubtful every couple followed these prescriptions to the letter, the church's influence loomed large, shaping attitudes and anxieties around intimacy. Confession also played a role. Newlyweds who strayed from these expectations could be questioned about their bedroom practices, making the wedding night not entirely private, even in the years that followed. The church framed sex as holy if done with the intent to create life, but shameful if it veered into indulgence. Couples were reminded constantly that their union had a higher purpose, filling the earth with children and securing the future of Christendom. This oversight served more than spiritual ends. By regulating consummation, the church also cemented its control over inheritance and legitimacy. If consummation could be proven, marriages were valid, heirs were legal, and dynastic claims secure. If not, annulments could be granted, alliances dissolved, and fortunes rearranged. In this way, the church transformed the marriage bed into a battleground of morality and power. To the newlyweds, it might have felt like a night of personal discovery, but to priests and bishops, it was a sacrament, an act that bound two souls under divine authority with rules that reached far beyond the bedroom. In the medieval world, consummation wasn't just an intimate act, it was legal evidence. The moment two bodies came together, a marriage passed from ceremony into binding contract, and because dynasties, inheritances, and land depended on that contract, proving consummation sometimes became a matter of politics, not privacy. Among royalty and nobility, witnesses were not merely tradition, they were insurance. Trusted attendants, midwives, or even clerics might remain in the room until they could swear that the couple had shared the bed as husband and wife. In the most high-stakes cases like royal marriages, proof of consummation could determine whether an heir was legitimate or a marriage annulled. A king or noble might use failure to consummate as grounds to escape an unwanted alliance. Conversely, a bride's family needed evidence to ensure their daughter's union and their political advantage was secure. Physical tokens often came into play. The bridal sheets, once stained with blood, were sometimes displayed as proof that the marriage had been consummated and the bride was indeed a virgin. Families could preserve these linens as evidence in disputes. While this practice varied across regions, its existence highlights how invasive and public the private act became. A single sheet could mean the difference between an unshakable marriage bond and a scandal that rocked kingdoms. For peasants, the politics were less dramatic but still real. A man accused of failing to consummate his marriage might face ridicule, fines, or even annulment. In some communities, neighbors expected to hear signs of the wedding night's success, whether through noise, jokes shouted through the window, or in some cases, the display of symbolic tokens the next morning. The idea of proof was never far from anyone's mind, no matter the class. The church courts too were deeply involved. Records show countless cases where couples argued over whether a marriage had been consummated. If one spouse claimed impotence or if no children came, the matter could end up in ecclesiastical courtrooms where physicians and priests tried to determine the truth of what had or hadn't happened. In short, consummation was less about intimacy than about legitimacy. What happened in the bedchamber echoed in courts, villages, and royal palaces. For the couple, it might have been an awkward or anxious night. For everyone else, it was evidence, proof, and politics rolled into one. Few concepts carried as much weight in medieval marriage as virginity. For brides in particular, chastity was not just a personal virtue, but a commodity that shaped alliances, dowries, and family honor. The wedding night became the ultimate test, and the pressure to demonstrate purity was immense. Virginity was tied closely to religious ideals. The church exalted the Virgin Mary as the model of womanhood, and brides were expected to reflect that purity until the moment of consummation. A virgin bride symbolized innocence, obedience, and the promise of fertility once united with her husband. Failure to prove this purity could stain not only her reputation, but that of her entire family. This expectation gave rise to rituals surrounding proof. As mentioned earlier, blood-stained sheets were sometimes displayed after the wedding night. Tangible evidence that the bride's hymen had been broken. Families could keep these linens as legal proof if disputes arose over legitimacy. Of course, not every wedding produced such evidence, biology being less cooperative than social custom. But the symbolism carried enormous power regardless. For men, the rules were far looser. While noble grooms were sometimes expected to show moderation before marriage, virginity was not demanded of them in the same way. A groom might enter the wedding bed with sexual experience, and in some circles, this was even considered a benefit, ensuring he could consummate quickly and produce heirs. This double standard highlights how purity was less about morality and more about controlling women's bodies and reputations. Virginity also carried political weight. Royal and aristocratic marriages often hinged on the assurance of a bride's chastity. If a princess or noble woman was rumored to be anything less than untouched, alliances could crumble. In some notorious cases, accusations of lost virginity were wielded as weapons to annul marriages or disinherit children. Yet, the emphasis on virginity was not purely oppressive. It also reflected the community's obsession with lineage. A bride who was unquestionably pure ensured that the children born from the marriage could not be contested. Virginity then was not only about moral ideals, but about securing bloodlines, inheritance, and political stability. On the wedding night, this expectation hung heavy over the chamber. For the bride, it was a test of her honor. For the groom, a confirmation of his rights, and for the families watching from outside, it was the seal on alliances that could shape generations. For all the official rules set by the church, the medieval wedding night was also wrapped in layers of superstition and folk magic. Families feared that bad luck, jealous neighbors, or even dark forces might interfere with a couple's first union. So protective rituals became just as important as the ceremony itself. One common practice was the use of charms hidden in the bridal chamber. Herbs like rue, rosemary, or yarrow were tucked beneath the mattress or woven into garlands hung over the bed. Each plant carried symbolic power. Rue was thought to drive away the evil eye. Rosemary brought fidelity and memory, and yarrow promised fertility. These protections worked on two levels, warding off spiritual threats and reminding the couple of the virtues expected in marriage. Fire and iron also played important roles. In some regions, an iron key or knife was placed near the bed to scare off evil spirits, since metal was believed to repel supernatural forces. A candle might be left burning overnight to guard against mischief from witches or demons whose envy was thought especially dangerous to newlyweds. Folklore also dictated what should not happen on the wedding night. Shoes placed the wrong way, a bed facing the wrong direction, or certain unlucky numbers of guests present at the bedding could all invite disaster. Couples and families took these warnings seriously, often adjusting rituals to avoid bad omens. Beyond protection, magic was also used to encourage fertility and passion. In some places, brides carried small amulets made of carved bone or shells believed to quicken conception. Special potions brewed from honey, herbs, or even animal parts were sometimes quietly prepared and consumed before the night began. While the church frowned on such superstitions, they remained stubbornly popular at every level of society. Community participation in these rituals added to the mix of belief and spectacle. Guests might sing songs laced with magical invocations or sprinkle grain, nuts, or even symbolic liquids around the doorway of the chamber. These acts blurred the line between joke and charm, reinforcing the idea that marriage was a communal affair guarded by tradition and ritual. Ultimately, the medieval wedding night was not only a test of love and legitimacy, it was also a spiritual battlefield between holy blessings, whispered prayers, and magical protections. Newlyweds lay at the center of a storm of beliefs, each one aiming to ensure that their union was safe, fertile, and unbreakable. For all its ritual and solemnity, the medieval wedding night was also a stage for laughter, nerves, and immense pressure. Newlyweds did not slip quietly into privacy. Instead, they carried the heavy weight of expectation, family honor, fertility hopes, and sometimes even political stability into the bedchamber. It is no wonder that anxiety was often laced with humor as a coping mechanism. For brides, especially young women married off in their teens, the wedding night could be a source of real fear. Many had little or no knowledge of sex, save for vague warnings or whispered advice from female relatives. The emphasis on virginity added to the tension. The expectation of bleeding, the fear of pain, and the knowledge that sheets might be scrutinized the next morning made the first night a daunting trial. Grooms too were not immune to pressure. A noble groom's ability to consummate swiftly and successfully was a matter of family pride. Failure could lead to humiliation, annulment, or worse, political disaster. Impotence, whether temporary or permanent, was not simply a personal matter, but a public scandal. In lower classes, while the stakes were less dynastic, the ridicule of neighbors and friends could be cutting. This anxiety often gave rise to humor, both supportive and cruel. Guests outside the chamber might sing songs, make ribald jokes, or bang pots and pans, both to lighten the mood and to mock the couple. These noisy traditions were part entertainment, part pressure, reminding the couple that their private act was very much a public concern. Even inside the chamber, humor had its place. Some, Attendants, especially in noble households, might offer playful encouragements or jokes as they prepared the bed. Fertility charms themselves sometimes carried a comic edge, symbolic foods, phallic objects, or songs filled with double meanings. Laughter, however awkward, helped diffuse the tension. Yet beneath the jokes lay real stress. Failure to perform could ruin reputations. Success, on the other hand, brought relief not just to the couple, but to the watching families who celebrated the sealing of the union with renewed festivities the next day. Thus, the medieval wedding night existed in a strange balance, half burden, half comedy. It was a moment of intense personal vulnerability played out under the gaze and the jokes of the entire community. By the late Middle Ages, many of the more extreme rituals surrounding the wedding night began to soften. But the legacy of these traditions left an indelible mark on European marriage culture. What began as a highly public, ritualized moment gradually shifted towards something more private. Though traces of the old customs lingered for centuries among the nobility, bedding ceremonies remained common well into the Renaissance, particularly in dynastic marriages where politics demanded proof of consummation. Royal weddings in France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire often ended with a formal bedding, complete with clergy, blessings, and witnesses ensuring that the marriage had officially begun. But over time, even monarchs sought more privacy, and the practice of staying to watch fell out of fashion, replaced by symbolic gestures rather than literal observation. In villages and towns, noisy traditions like serenading, pot-banging, or tossing grain at the bridal chamber slowly gave way to lighter customs. Humor and fertility symbols persisted, but the level of intrusion waned. Instead of neighbors demanding proof, communities celebrated the couple the next day with feasts, dances, or games, trusting that the union had been properly sealed. The church, meanwhile, continued to exert influence, but even its grip relaxed in practice. Confessors still reminded couples of approved times and positions, but enforcement became more symbolic than literal. As Europe moved into the early modern period, ideas of romance and personal affection began to creep into the institution of marriage, changing how people viewed the wedding night itself. Yet the echoes of the medieval wedding night are still with us. The word honeymoon carries traces of the fertility rituals involving honey. The tossing of rice at weddings echoes the old practice of scattering grain for fertility. Even the focus on the first night as a significant milestone reflects the medieval insistence that consummation was the true seal of marriage. Looking back, the medieval wedding night was a strange mix: sacred duty, political contract, fertility, ritual, and community entertainment. To the people of the time, none of this seemed invasive. It was simply how marriages were secured and celebrated. For us, it's a reminder of how much marriage has always been shaped not just by love, but by the social, religious, and cultural forces of the world around.